first reading, first lesson can be found in There we go. Sorry. Today's first lesson can be found, it is a reading from Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 28. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. Thank you, God, for the reading of his word.
Thank you, Cindy. Well, we shifted just last week, going back to where we were in pre-pandemic days, looking at Sermon on the Mount. And if you remember, in the early spring, we worked through the Beatitudes, those indications that God's work moves forward, his kingdom belongs to those who, the everyday, ordinary folks like you and me, the ones he said that are poor and meek and the mournful, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, those who can show mercy, and those who are pure of heart and the peacemakers, those folks who are persecuted for doing the things that are right. He said all of them are blessed and reflect God's glory. They, in fact, are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And then he moves from those Beatitudes to some hard teachings. They can feel hard, kind of confusing, and they go right to the heart of where we live. What does a heart that's been remodeled by God, that's been transformed by God, or as Cindy just read, that's turned from a heart of hardness into a heart of flesh, what does that look like? And Jesus doesn't pull punches. He gets right into the nitty-gritty stuff of human life. This is what Dallas Willard says. Says when Jesus deals with moral evil and goodness, he doesn't begin by theorizing. He plunges immediately into the guts of human existence. Raging anger, contempt, hatred, obsessive lust, divorce, verbal manipulation, revenge, slapping, suing, cursing, coercing, and begging. It's the stuff of soap operas. It's the stuff of daily news. And it's the stuff of our lives, isn't it? Well, when Jesus talks about those things, and he talks about the fulfillment of his law, he does so in a way that can raise some questions. It can seem contradictory or confusing. I'm going to take a look at just a few of these verses in chapter 5 of Matthew, beginning in verse 17, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So right after those Beatitudes and the salt and light teaching, Jesus says this: "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly, I tell you this, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter or the smallest stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, whoever sets aside one of the least of these little commandments or teaches others to do accordingly will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments, they will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you this, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the teachers and the Pharisees, you will certainly not enter into the kingdom of heaven." Wow. So here's the first question that comes to my mind in reading this. Are we under the law or not? Jesus says the smallest jot or tittle, that's like a little dot of an I or the crossing of a T, none of that will be released from the law until it's all fulfilled. But in truth, I don't follow the Old Testament law. I enjoyed a great shrimp taco just not long ago. Forbidden. I'm wearing pants right now and a shirt that are made out of mixed fibers. Forbidden. And in a more grim reality, it's quite likely that none of us adults or even some of our kids would have made it to our current ages without having been stoned, because that was the consequence for disrespecting your parents. But we set those things aside. We don't follow them. In fact, Jesus himself seemed to set aside the law. There's a passage of him and his disciples on a Sabbath, an afternoon that was set aside for no work. They're on their way, wandering somewhere. They enter a field and they glean the grain. It's their lunch, picking heads of grain, which was labor, picking labor. It drew attention. It got him in trouble. It looked like he was following the law only when it was convenient. And in fact, Jesus seemed to want to make a point of not observing the Sabbath the way the teachers of the law and the Pharisees taught it. He healed no less than 7 times on the Sabbath. He healed Peter's mother-in-law on the Sabbath. And a guy with a withered hand, he did in public. He granted sight to a man that was born blind on the Sabbath, outright in the temple courts. A hunchbacked woman he healed. A man with dropsy, and he called out a demon. He cured a lame guy who had been lame for 38 years, who set up his bed in the path of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Somebody that the whole community knew he chose to heal on the Sabbath. Well, was it set aside or was it not? Are we under the law or aren't we? It seems confusing here. But a second question comes to my mind, and it's this. Jesus scolds the teachers of the laws and the Pharisees because they burden people with the law. It says this, he says in Matthew 23, he warns his disciples, he says, listen, don't do what the Pharisees do, for they don't practice what they preach. They tie up heavy and cumbersome loads on the people, and they don't do anything. They don't even lift a finger to help them with it. Well, but then Jesus, he says, I tell you the truth. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you won't be part of the kingdom. That feels pretty burdensome too. Not only what the Pharisees require, but more than that. Well, how are we to make sense of those things? Did Jesus add an impossible burden with these teachings? As we work our way through the Sermon on the Mount, we'll see that it looks like he has. But how do we understand this, Jesus' relation to the law? And first we can say this. One is the way he interpreted and applied the law had not to do with its technical letter, but rather with its intended purpose. If we think about that woman, with the hunchbacked woman, he called out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, because he said, listen, if your animal fell into a ditch and got injured on the Sabbath, you would help your cow on the Sabbath to alleviate pain and suffering of one of your animals, and yet you're upset that I've liberated this woman who's lived with a hunchback for all this time. And the same with the guy that had dropsy. He says, which one of you Pharisees wouldn't pull your child out of a well if they fell into one on a Sabbath? And yet, you accuse me because I've helped this poor brother who's suffered his whole life. Jesus says this, choosing to serve others to fulfill the intent and the purpose of the law is always more important than its technical fulfillment, fulfilling its spirit over its letter. When he was caught picking grain on the Sabbath day, he told the Pharisees this. He said, the Sabbath is good, but the Sabbath was made to serve us, not us to serve the Sabbath. The law, he was saying, is to help guide us, just as Cindy read in Ezekiel, to guide us into the way of life, not to become a cumbersome burden that we have to bear. So first, it's the intent of the law, its purpose. But secondly, Jesus seems to indicate this. That's really what is at stake in the actions, our actions, as we follow God's teaching and guidance in the world around us, is about a shift of our hearts rather than rote compliance or obedience. This is what we get a good look at this later on in Matthew 23. Jesus has been out aggravating the Pharisees, and they have caught his attention so much that they want to trip him up so they can accuse him and eliminate him. So they invite him in to dinner. They're having lunch together, and the Pharisees notice that Jesus and his disciples don't take the time to purify their hands and undergo the ritual washing. It says this. It says they noticed that he didn't first wash, and Jesus replies to them. He says, "Oh, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, you wash the outside of a cup and a dish, but inside you're filled with wickedness and greed. You foolish people. Don't you think that the one who made the outside also made the inside? But it's not that is without that makes you dirty, but that which is within and inside of you. The desire of God is for you to be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean." He goes on, he says, "You're like whitewashed sepulchres. You're like a tomb that's been covered white. It looks nice and clean, but inside it's just filled with dirty, rotten bones," or as Dr. Seuss would say, and I often have to admit of my own heart often, it's filled with rotten socks, stinky on the inside. Jesus says, if you take care of what is on the inside, then the outside will be clean too. Jesus' intent is not to make us people who can fulfill God's law for the sake of fulfilling God's law, but rather much bigger than that. He wants to undertake what might seem like an impossible project, and a project that sometimes I admit I feel hopeless about in my own life. And it's this. It's the remaking of our hearts, so that what the law intends flows out of us naturally, so that we love from the heart even those people who don't like us and we don't like, those people even who would wish to do us harm. A heart from which we seek the well-being of other people, even folks who don't look like us or talk like us, but we work for their well-being. Jesus wants to make us over from the inside so that what flows out is God's full intention for the flourishing of his people, to make us a blessing and bearers of peace to all of those around us. You know, I think it's a common experience for us to be like the Pharisees, concerned more with the outside appearance than the inside reality. I don't know if you can point to episodes like that in your life. I'll give you an example from mine. I'm not proud of it, but there's enough distance that I don't feel too much shame. During my graduate study years, to do the doctorate in theology, I had to show that I was competent in some research languages, so I could study the writing of other theologians and engage with them in a critical way. I had to do that with my field was more contemporary, so it was modern languages of French and German. I had to establish my competency in. I'd never really studied another language. I somehow got through college and undergrad without doing it. I counted computer language as a foreign language for me. I have trouble with English, really. And it was frightening, but I decided I'm going to jump in and do this. So one summer I took intensive classes back to back. I did about a 6-week intensive in theological German, and then 2 weeks later did an intensive 6-week in French. And at the end of those the end of those courses, I took the competency exams. The exams that showed that, yeah, Greg knows what he's doing with these other languages. He can do research. Well, I passed the exams, remarkably so. I made a half-hearted effort of keeping up with the German for about a year, reading the New Testament and some German poets like Rilke and Wittgenstein, a philosopher. But in reality, inside, I hadn't really mastered either of those languages. They did not become research languages for me. I would never trust my own translations. But I met the letter of the requirement. I passed the competency test, but I hadn't been changed. Well, that might work for a PhD in philosophical theology, but it's not enough. It doesn't satisfy Jesus in the project that he's undertaking with us. He wants to transform us fully from the inside out. And think about that. Whatever else is going on in your life right now, whatever the ups or downs, the personal crises or family dilemmas or the work difficulties or the personal accomplishments and joys that you might be experiencing, whatever those things happen to be, right now in this moment, Jesus is calling you into working with him on this project that matters more than anything else. It's a transformation of our heart. Isn't that something? A heart through which the fruit of the Spirit will grow naturally. A life and a heart that can bear hardship with hopefulness, that can encounter irritation joyfully, that can bear with difficulties with long suffering, and that will indeed be a blessing like salt and light to the ones we interact with and the world around us. Not because we're looking to an external law and seeking to fulfill its letter, but because our hearts have been transformed from the inside out, so such that it overflows. In the weeks ahead, we'll look more at what that means in the context of real things, like anger and lust, and keeping our word and making promises. That's an exciting thing. Something that we're not asked to do on our own. We're actually asked to just keep our eyes on Christ, stay connected to that vine, and let that new life flow in us. But we're also invited to do it with one another as we do. And what happens on Sunday mornings with each other, and as we connect throughout the week.